So welcome everybody. It is our honor today to host Major General McGee, the Director of the Army Talent Management Task Force. And today he's going to give us a brief about some changes to the Army's talent management. So without further ado, sir.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. How are you today? All right, it's a pretty good crowd. Okay, I'm JP McGee. I am the Director of the Army's Talent Management Task Force, and for about the next hour or so, what I'd like to do is explain to you what's going on in terms of the changes that you're going to start seeing in terms of the management of the officer corps. I want to first off by framing it in terms of the bigger, why we're doing these things and the bigger changes, and then I will stick around here as long as you want and answer your questions, whether that's in the group or if you want to do that one-on-one. And if you have any questions that you want to have an individual bring them to me, if you've got any thoughts on how we can do this better, I'm certainly open for this. You'll see that we have given you a survey. I would request for you to do a couple things. First up, fill it out honestly. Okay, second off, make sure you include your DoD ID number in there, because if you give us any responses that we don't like, we can track you down and hunt you down, okay? No, that's not it. We want you to fill out your DoD ID number, because that way we can say, infantry second lieutenants, sort of have this opinion. Field artillery lieutenant colonels feel this way. And so it allows us to slice and dice it. And there is actually a part in there that says if you want us to contact it, we can give your contact information. But that's why it's really important for you to do both. So the first thing, if this works, you should see is a quick video we put together that sort of gives you a highlight, and then I'll highlight a lot of the things from the video in my comments. So if we can go to the video, please.
Sir, we don't have a link to the video because we don't have a wireless connection.
Oh, you don't have wireless? Okay, so we're not doing a video today. Okay, next slide. So we can't play that, okay. Okay, so you all know that the Army is going through a significant modernization effort. We're changing all sorts of things. We have stood up Army Futures Command to help us see the future better, to help us develop a whole new doctrine called multi-domain operations for how the Army is going to fight in the future, incorporating all these sort of changing technologies that we have and getting ready for what a future battlefield is going to look like. I think right now here in Europe, you probably every day see the unique nature of the competitive environment that we're having here against Russia as this great power competition is starting to unfold, and you're able to live that every single day. We're also looking at a different way as an Army of how we're going to start equipping our forces. That's the CFTs, these cross-functional teams. But really at the core of everything we do as the Army is our people. And so our task force, the Army Talent Management Task Force, is charged with driving these changes for the Army in order to develop a 21st century talent management system. Okay, so if you take a look at what we're trying to do within the Talent Management Task Force and making a talent management approach to the Army, you really need to understand some of the core tensions. And one of the key tensions that we have today is the fact that the current system that we've been operating under is really written based on two pieces of law. So if you're an officer, there's a lot of law that is involved with how we manage the officer corps, passed on to us by Congress. So one is the 1947 Officer Personnel Act. It was passed right at the end of World War II as we were trying to figure out what we're going to do in a post-World War II world and what we're going to do with this new organization called the Air Force and what this was going to look like, okay? That was one. The next one is the Defense Officers Personnel Management Act of 1980, which is then the Army and the military was trying to figure out what does it mean to be an all-volunteer force, okay? Both of those are pretty old documents, right? Even the newest one is almost 40 years old now. And both of those were very much steeped in the thinking of an industrial-aged approach. Okay? So an industrial-aged approach sort of says this if you're the Army. It says every year we're going to bring in a bunch of people. We're going to train them to a minimum acceptable level of competence. And then we're going to sort of treat everybody the same. So an artillery captain is an artillery captain. I can take him as a series of interchangeable parts and jam him into any artillery captain job. A transportation corps major is the same as any other transportation corps major, and I can take he or she and I can jam her into any job across the Army as well as it is. Okay? Further, we say, because it's a big population of people you've got to deal with, the only way we can actually manage this group of people is by just having this very strictly time-based conveyor belt sort of methodology. So you're going to get looked at for promotion at year 6. You're going to get looked at for your promotion at year 11. And it's happened with complete regularity, but it's the only way you could manage this very, very big group. Okay, so in 1947 and 1980, that was largely true. In 2019, it's not. Okay? So part of what we're trying to do is now bring in information age technologies in order to assist in the way that we're managing our people. And if you take an information age approach, what do you say? You say that as an organization like the Army, you still need to bring in a lot of people, and you've still got a lot of people you've got to manage. Okay? And you've still got to get them trained. But you can take their uniqueness, you can take their knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences, what we are calling their talents, and use that to assist in them. It's the recognition that maybe an infantry officer develops on a different timeline and schedule than a cyber officer. Okay? And it's also a recognition that each of you come in with strengths and weaknesses, and one of the things we've got to figure out with those is what are your weaknesses, so we can develop them into, maybe if not strengths, at least raise up your levels where you're weak in, and then maximize your strengths so you can contribute best to the mission of the United States Army. Okay? It's a unique, it's an understanding that, if you ask this question, who's the best officer in this theater today? The only right answer is, what job are you considering them for? Because there are some jobs that, each of you are going to be much better at, and some other jobs you're probably not going to be as good at. And that's one of the imperatives for us to figure that out. First, to develop you as an officer, and then figure out how you get employed as an officer over time. You can't do that without, which is one of the key fundamentals, us getting this granular level of knowledge about the knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences of every officer that we have within the inventory. Okay? And then the other piece of this is we start looking at different sort of timelines and what that could be. And so these are all these changes that we're looking at, and some of them I'll explain to you in a little bit more detail as we continue on with this brief. This is not just about managing like the top 1% or the top 2%. As a matter of fact, I tend to think, based on my experiences and what we've been able to see, is where we're going to get actually the biggest gain for the Army is not in managing like the top 5%, but managing that top 6 to 60%. A group of people the Army has always sort of struggled with how to take them and actually use them to the best. So if you're a superstar in your field, you generally know what to do with you. But if you're middle of the road really looking, and you haven't been able to differentiate yourself so far, doesn't mean you can't in the future. This understanding is going to make us, allow you to put you in positions and develop you in such a way that you can maximize your potential and be able to do that. And I think that's going to have a big impact across the Army. Okay, the guidance from the Secretary and the Chief of Staff of the Army is very, very clear to our task force. It's not to take the current system and try to make it a little bit better. Okay? It's not to make the current system better, it's to make a new and better system. Okay, so what we're going to do are changes that are not like little 10% tweaks on the margins. They have told us to go for 10x changes. So if you're going to come and say, hey, you guys doing a lot of things that are fundamentally changing things, that's good, because that's what we've been told to do. Okay, I give an example all the time of what the difference between 10x and 10% is. Okay, if you took a bunch of engineers from Ford Motor Company, you took them to an offsite and you said, the average fuel efficiency of a car within Ford Motor Company is 50 miles per gallon. And we want to have a 10% rise in our fuel efficiency. Those engineers would go off to an offsite, they'd sit there, they'd tweak, they'd look at their plans, they'd figure a way to like tweak on the engine, maybe adjust some things, fix the carburetor, things on the margins that would drive you to have that 10% mile per gallon improvement, right? You get that 5 extra miles, you reach the goal of 55 miles per gallon, you'll be mission complete. But if you grab those same engineers and stuck them in an offsite and said the goal for Ford Motor Company is we're going to move to our standard fuel efficiency on our cars being 500 miles per gallon, they would fundamentally have to relook what it means to be an automobile. They would fundamentally have to relook the relationship between the car and the tires and the driver. Just so you know, a car's fuel efficiency, only 55% of that is derived from the motor. And so that's very much our mission. Our mission is to drive this 10x change that fundamentally relooks how the different parts of how we manage the officer corps come together and from how we acquire, develop, employ, and retain in order to really maximize the contribution of every officer to the mission of the United States Army. Okay, why is this important? Because uniquely to our service, people define our organizations. The Army puts technology on our people. The other services put their people inside technology. There is a difference. The chief wants us to be the premier organization in the world for human development, and he's concerned that we have lost that, or we're in the process of losing that. Okay, you don't maintain that leadership position in the entire world by keeping practices and policies, written in the 1980s, or even worse, written in 1947. Okay, and so that's why there's this need for change. It's also important to highlight and to make everyone understand, and again, we got a junior audience here, but we have a new Chief of Staff of the Army who has a slightly unique background. Okay, this Chief of Staff of the Army served as a division commander, longest serving division commander in the history of the 101st. Then he served as the G1 as the Army for 3 years, and then he moved to be the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army for another 2 years. Okay? I can say this definitively, that there has been, at least in my time in the Army, and probably much before, no Chief of Staff of the Army who understands the people business of the Army better than this Chief. Okay? It's the reason why, when he took over as Chief of Staff of the Army, he said people are his #1 priority, and reforming our personnel systems is one of his key priorities. Okay? Because he uniquely understands, based on his background, how we manage our people and how much room for improvement there exists as we start to move forward. Okay, but why also is this important? This is also really important because as we start taking a look at doing what the National Security Strategy says we need to do, is get ready for large-scale ground combat operations against near-peer threats. War against near-peer threats looks very different than what we've done the last 20 years. And really, it looks different than what we've done in many, many of our wars. Okay, so near-peer threat means we could be fighting against countries that have larger populations than ours. Normally, that's been an advantage for us. Okay, big population on our side. We're going to be fighting against people who have economies the same or larger economies than ours. That hasn't happened in a long, long time in our history. Okay, we're going to be fighting against people who have a technological, parity with where we are. Okay. If that's what the future of war looks like, then we need to take our most valuable asset, our people, and we need to maximize the contribution of every single one of them. We can't afford to waste any of your talents in the accomplishment of our mission if that's what the future of our country, if that's what the future of warfare looks like, and that's our role in protecting our country. So it's imperative that we do this. The other pieces of this is that although the change has been fast so far in terms of how technology is changing our lives, I mean, let's be honest, the iPhone, which has been transformational, has only been around for like 12, 13 years. Okay? Think about that. Like 17 years ago, 18 years ago, no one had an iPhone. Now everybody has something or something equivalent to it. Think about what that means in terms of data transfer. Think about that, what that means in terms of how we've been able to process and share information globally. So all those changes that have happened from then until now, it's only going to happen faster now. Because the foundational the foundations of all this technological change continue to drive it at a faster and faster pace as it does it. Our services ability, our Army's ability to be able to adapt to that technological change is absolutely critical. And I'm going to do something interactive here, okay? And I'm going to throw out to you some of the changes that are going to impact the way the Army fights ground combat for the next 20 to 30 years. I'm going to name the field, and you need to tell me where you think the expertise in this field exists. In the military or in the civilian world, okay? So, cloud computing. Civilian. Nanotechnology. Civilian. What else? AI. Civilian. Machine learning. Civilian. Bioengineering. Civilian. Okay. You get the point? So our ability to be able to wrap these changes that are happening in the outside world and fold them into our ability to fight as an Army are going to be incredibly important. Okay? You don't do that with a system that is so rigid that we don't allow people to come in laterally in our organizations with skill sets that we need in order to excel. Okay, you've got to be more agile, you've got to be more adaptive, and you've got to be more open to talent from coming across the entire country in order to help us with our mission, okay? The current system makes that very, very difficult, and it's one of the things we're trying to change. The other thing that's changing in our country are the expectations of junior officers coming in. And there are a lot of junior officers here. I mean, I'm going to tell you what you already know. But, you and your cohort look at things differently than I did when I came into the Army 30 years ago. There is now a different set of expectations for what it means to be an Army spouse, right? Like when I came in, that was not very much the case. Army spouse, their job was effectively to be an Army spouse, right? And that was their sort of profession. And some of them worked, some of them didn't, but that was not the norm. Now across the United States, more than 50% of households have dual income. It's now the norm, and so our ability as a nation as an Army, to change to some of these things are really important for us to maintain our position of retaining our best and our brightest. Okay? And so this very rigid system that we've been using, I think, starts to run counter to that. And one of the ways we're trying to do this is we're trying to say that your preference as an officer is really important. Okay? Your preference is going to matter in terms of how we make assignment decisions about you and where you can go. That's one of the ways we represent that. Okay? And the final piece I like to say on this is, if you go around and you talk to industries, and you talk to these very competitive industries, what they will say about how they manage people is they will say that they are in a war for talent. Think about that. They say they're in a war for talent. Okay, we tend to just sort of think we've got a bunch of people and we sort of employ them. Okay? And it's interesting to me that the civilian industries have taken our sort of, we're supposed to be really good at, which is waging wars. They said that's the level of importance that they put in how they're maintaining having the right people, getting the right people in their organizations, keeping those right people in the organizations, developing them throughout the time. Because they know if they don't do that well, they will become extinct and they will go out of business. We need to understand that we're in that same war for talent with all these other organizations. Whether they're government organizations or civilian organizations, we need to start adapting that or we're just going to get run over. Next slide. Or no, next slide. This was the last slide. There we go. Okay, this is an interesting slide because I use it to highlight how we've been running our system for many, many years now. And it's the system under which you've actually, you're being brought into, and depending on what rank you've spent a couple of years. Okay, so the current system that we run today in terms of how we manage our off score is an attrition-based model. Okay, very much steeped in industrial age practices. We say we're going to bring in a bunch of people, okay, and we're going to sort of try to hold on to as many as we can, and in the end, we've got to be able to sort of make these quantitative gates, okay, not qualitative, but quantitative sort of gates. So I'm going to talk to you from the left, and I'm going to work my way across. So every year in the active component, the Army needs to commission 5,000 second lieutenants. Just in rough numbers, 1,000 come from West Point, 1,000 come from ROTC. I'm sorry, 1,000 come from West Point, 1,000 come from OCS, and 3,000 come from ROTC. On top of the ROTC mission of 3,000 active duty, they also have to create and produce 2,500 Guard and Reserve officers. So ROTC every year needs to create 5,500 second lieutenants across all components. Okay, that is a tremendously heavy accessions load for them to have to carry and bring in. Okay? And what it means is they can't nearly be as selective as they would like to. Okay? We bring in 5,000 second lieutenants because we want to make a qualitative and quantitative cut by the time we make major at about 80%. Okay? But what happens when you have to commission 5,500 officers every year? Let me explain one part of that happens. So the first thing is you can't tell your cadets what they're going to study. Okay? So I want you to stop and think for a second, and I want you to think about those fields of study that you think we should have in our officer corps for the next 20 to 30 years to make us ready to fight a future war. Think what 2 or 3 top fields you think we should have represented within the population of officers that we're bringing in terms of skill sets. Okay? So you probably got a field or 2 in your mind there. Okay? And I'm going to ask you this question. What is the #1 degree that we produce out of ROTC? What type of degree in terms of what field of study do we produce out of ROTC every year? Nope, it's criminal justice. Criminal justice. You take criminal justice and criminal science as 2 related fields, it's about 13% of the ROTC officers get commissioned into criminal justice. Okay, did any of you think that criminal justice is going to be a significant field for the way we fight wars in the future, and we need to have that embedded in that degree? Okay. So you can see how this starts to create a problem. It creates a further problem when I'll tell you that you don't actually hit a STEM degree, science, technology, engineering, or math, until you get to the 7th degree that we produce out of ROTC, and that's 3.8% with mechanical engineering. Okay. So one of the reasons we have to do that is because we don't have a good system for what we do with officers in the first 5 years. So let's talk about what we do with the officers in the first 5 years. So some of you guys are in this window. Okay, so we bring officers in. If you've gone to West Point or a 4-year ROTC program, we've got 4 years of data on you based on how you were as a cadet. We have information on how you were at your officer basic course, so we've got some data points on you. And then, 3 years in, we've got 3 or 4 OERs on you based on how you've done actually in terms of unit data. So we've got all this information about you. Okay, what do we do as an Army to shape the retention of the most talented 1,000 officers that we commission every year? So we do nothing, right? Like, do we incentivize battalion and brigade commanders with any tools? Do we help battalion and brigade commanders identify, through not just their observation, but other observations that, with the information that's available for us, to be able to say, hey, look, in your formation, you've got 25 lieutenants, and there's 10 of them that you really should focus on getting them to stay in, because we think they've got the talents, and they've got the talents that can contribute to the mission of the Army for the long term. Right? So maybe we should do that. Maybe we should start polling our second lieutenants and first lieutenants and find out what are they thinking about their desire to stay in the Army or get out of the Army. And over time we could find out why our most talented are actually leaving the Army. And then we could build incentive systems, whether that's educational or whatever, to retain our guys. Instead what we do is we let you come in, we let you run through 5 years of active duty service, and if you get out, well, you sort of suck because you got a weak heart and you don't love the Army, right? And if you stay in, that's great. And we have no idea whether we're retaining the right talents of what we want to do. We just know that, the only talent you have to have is you want to stick around the Army. That's not a smart way to run an organization like this anymore. And we've got the opportunities now to be able to do this in a different way, so we can be much more targeted with how we do that. But how we retain, because we're largely a closed entry system, right? Like, people don't come in great numbers laterally. Like, that's a really, really important thing. But because we've continued to run this in this industrial fashion, what we actually say is, hey, look, at year 11, we got to make 2,150 majors. And as long as we can do about an 80% cut to make 2,150 majors, the system's running fine. Like, we've never identified of those ones that we're keeping in, whether we kept the top 50% of the commission group, of a year group, or the bottom 50%. We just know we've got enough numbers, and as long as we can run a board that has an 80% selection rate just purely based on numbers, we think the system's running fine. Okay, that's what it means to run a data poor environment, as opposed to a data rich. Okay, and those are the things we're looking at trying to change here very, very rapidly. Okay, on the right-hand side of this, I'll highlight something else. You'll see how many colonels that we create every year. So every year we promote about 450 colonels. Okay, it's a really important rank. I think in a future system, it's the most important rank for us to optimize around. I'll give you a couple of reasons why. So you may think it's general officer, but the fact of the matter is, every year we only promote about 40 brigadier generals. And here's the crazy thing. 3 years after we promote those 40 brigadier generals, half of them have to be out of the Army. Okay, so I was promoted to 1-star general, brigadier general, in 2016. It's now 2019. Half of the brigadier generals I was promoted with are now out of the Army because they didn't get picked up for 2 stars. It's just the way the system runs right now. Okay, so you don't get, for most of these generals, they don't stick around actually that much longer as a general officer. Half of them are out 3 years later. Whereas with colonels, nowadays we've got the ability to retain a colonel to 40 years of service if he or she would like to. That just was given to us by Congress to be able to do that. And as you guys become more senior, you'll find colonels play a huge role in all of these really important staffs we have across the entire DoD. So at the Office of Secretary of Defense, on the Joint Staff, and the combatant commands, on the Army staff. I mean, colonels play this huge role because they're these very experienced operators who've been in the field for a while and we give a whole lot of authority. And now we've got the ability for some of them to be able to keep them in even longer and have them continue to contribute. But again, let's take a look at what we do with colonels at the end of their career. Now, we as a nation, at like 22 years when they've been promoted, have invested like 26 years as a nation into that officer. And what do we do to shape the retention of the very best of our colonels? Nothing. We do the same thing like we did in the beginning, right? If you want to stay, stay. If you want to get out, get out. After you're 3 years in, you're already fully vested for your retirement, and then you can get out. We do nothing to say, hey, this group of small sub, these 10 or 15 colonels actually have some unique skills that we want to try to incentivize them to stay to 30 years or 33 years or 34 years. We don't do anything like that. We just sort of let the system run itself. And if they get out, that's okay. And as long as we've got enough numbers, we're okay. We're not looking at the talents, we're just looking at the raw numbers. Okay? So I use this to highlight, one, how we currently manage it, and two, how we need to change this over time to become a system that actually manages people by something other than numbers. And the way you do that is by managing them by their talents. Next slide. Okay, so talent management is a new approach. It's like a new scheme of maneuver or concept of operations. It is now part of the way the Army manages its people. So you as a leader should understand this. So what we define talent management is how we acquire, develop, and employ and retain the officer corps, and then the non-commissioned officer corps, and then the civilian corps. Right now we've been told to focus on the officer corps because it's small enough to sort of work these pilots and prototypes, but we're moving into the NCO corps, and then eventually this is going to move over to the civilian workforce as well. Okay, so that's the definition of talent management, and then talent is defined by the Army as the unique intersection of knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences. Okay, so that's what it is. And again, I want to highlight that preferences is listed there and explicit as part of the talent. Okay, and then you'll hear some people say attributes instead of behaviors. There's a larger, within the field of psychology, a discussion about whether it's an attribute or a behavior. The Army went with behaviors. And simply put, we went with behaviors because to the Army, we're interested if you have the attributes of an ethical officer. We're actually really interested if you behave ethically. Okay? And so that's what the Army decided, and that's what we're going with for what it is. But knowledge, skills, behaviors, and preferences define talents for the Army. And it's important for us to understand this because when you talk talent and you talk talent management with the other services or other industries, they all define them all completely differently. So just keep that in mind. Next slide. Okay, so how do we take this gigantic system that we have right now and transition this to this new system? So first off, you've got to have an approach for how you're going to get there. And I've used this slide to give you an illustration of how we're trying to do this. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the current system that we have right now. Okay, I want to be very clear that I think the Army is executing the very best industrial-aged personnel management system in the world. Okay? And it's being managed by hardworking, professional AG officers and everyone else associated with it who are struggling their best and working very, very hard to make this system work. Okay? But it is increasingly like taking a bicycle to a motorcycle race. Like you can be pedaling that as fast as you want to, but you're always going to be behind because what everyone else is using. And so that's this key challenge of how we're trying to move this and make this more of an information age system. Okay? But again, it's got some strengths. We try to take the strengths from one side and move it to the right side, and it's got some gaps that have been identified over time. Okay? And that's our challenge, is to sort of retain the strengths and then start making this a much better system for the future. So if you look at the right-hand side of this, you'll see what the future goal is. And I think the system's always going to be changing. It's not like a static end state. It's going to be a continually adapting end state. Okay? And there you see this information age system. At the core of it is this idea of flexible career paths. And it doesn't show up on this slide. But I think underneath this idea of flexible career paths, it's got three pillars. Okay? So one is the management of the officer corps. Okay, so I'm going to really hit that specifically with how we assign officers. And I think that's the ATAP, largely. Okay? And then the next one is the organizational alignment around how we manage the officer corps. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions here. You guys can answer my questions. Some of these are pretty easy to answer, and then one of them is a trick question. Okay? So I'm going to describe to you a field within the Army, and you're going to tell me what organization and what individual is in charge of this. We've got a junior audience here, so I may help you out with some of this, because I don't expect you to know like the 4 stars. But if I am talking about matters of training and doctrine, what organization and what individual has that responsibility? TRADOC, General Funk. If I ask you about what organization and individual is in charge of logistics and all material related issues within the Army, What organization? AMC. What individual? General Perna. If I ask you what organization and individual is in charge of CONUS-based readiness for all Army units, you would say Forces Command, General Garrett. So here's the trick question. What organization and individual is in charge of managing the strategic direction of the United States Army's Officer Corps? I always love it when I ask this because a lot of people say, aren't you? So I'm not. Okay? So the fact of the matter is the Army has disaggregated this authority and the organizations over a whole bunch of different organizations and a whole bunch of different people. Okay? So in no particular order, and you watch, when you trace these organizations up, they really don't intersect until they get to the chief or to the secretary. Okay, so in no particular order, you've got G3FM, which does all the force structure for the Officer Corps, and you've got G3 Training, which does all funding for all training, all funding for all training of the Officer Corps. They work for the J3, goes up to the chief. You've got the individual branch commandants, all of them, who do all the career mapping and the 600-3 inputs and all that piece. They work for the CAC commander. Okay, so that goes up to TRADOC, and TRADOC eventually goes up to the chief. You've got all the different functional area proponents who are in charge of their functional areas, whether that's public affairs or space ops or whatever. They go never, you don't reach the top of them until you get to the chief. You've got HRC, you've got the G1, you've got the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. And again, none of these guys all sort of work for each other in any sort of unified piece. So we've taken this really important authority, how we manage our people, how we manage our officers, and we've spread it across all of these different organizations. And because of that, we make these changes, and then we don't see the changes all the way through. Because everybody interprets this their own way, and there's no overarching structure or individual who's responsible for it. It's the reason why in my career the following things have happened. Some of you guys are in the front rows here, a little more senior will see this in the back. Some of you guys won't understand these terms. It's why we said in like 2006 and 2007 we were going to make military transition teams, special police transition teams, police transition teams. Command of those organizations was going to be the same as a tactical battalion, and we're going to treat those officers the same. And we did. We said we're going to take training battalions a while ago and make them equal as important as tactical battalions and treat the officers the same. We did. We said we're going to take a program called the AFPAC-HANS and we're going to treat these guys uniquely and specially, and they're going to be specially managed. Didn't happen. We have said that with the SFABs we're going to treat them uniquely and differently, and I think we will. But it's going to be a challenge against the structure because no one's actually overall in charge of it and has oversight. Okay? That's further compounded by up until just recently, we didn't even have a forum within the Army where we came together and talked about the direction of our people. Right? We have senior leaders readiness forums and training forums and all these sort of forums, but it never came back in the Army and reached the highest levels of the Army senior leaders. Our new Chief of Staff has said that there's going to be a monthly all things people meeting so he can keep his finger on the pulse of which way we are moving in terms of the management, not just of the officers, but all of our people within our Army. It's a way for him to force and start having better organizational alignment because all of those organizations need to show up and be ready to talk and making sure that we're meeting his goals and guidance for which way he wants to drive us. So that's a really positive change. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are on the right-hand side in terms of a future system. We talk a lot about flexibility, but I do want to highlight one which is really sort of interesting, okay? And that is the idea of leveraging technology. Okay, do we have anybody here who's like an S1, G1 type person right now? Anyone who, I know we have at least one, right? Are they hiding? Okay, I got a couple back there. Okay, so I didn't know this till I was in this job, but we took a good look at the different IT systems that manage the people within our Army, specifically the Officer Corps. Okay? Almost every single IT system that we have that managed the Officer Corps was written in code in the late 1980s, early 1990s, by codes that nobody uses anymore. Okay? None of the systems talk to one another. And the thing that I find striking is that none of them have a predictive capability. So they can tell you where you are today, sort of, with difficulty. They can tell you where we've been the last 10, 15, 20 years, sort of, with difficulty. But they can't tell you the impact of decisions today on what that's going to mean in the future. Okay? So it is only a slight overstatement to say that the officer corps of the Army today is managed mostly by Excel spreadsheet. Yeah, pretty old technology. Okay, further, what this looks like is, and this just happened 7, 8 months ago, the Secretary of the Army said, I want to consider making all company commands a minimum of 18 months. So I want to change the standard in the Army and say it's not 12 months anymore, I want to move to 18 months because I want to have company commanders stay longer in command. Okay, I would think that with that, what we would do is we would plug this into some gigantic computer, some gunculator that would come back and it would say, well, you need to understand, Mr. Secretary, this, the ramifications of that decision are that if you're going to have company command be extended to 18 months, then the command queue at Fort Polk will have just moved from 18 months to 27 months, and we assess that 30% of the officers won't stay an extra 9 months at Fort Polk to be a company commander. Or maybe they will, whatever that is. We also assess that this is going to have a negative impact to the queue in order to get to CGSC because you're going to have people now who aren't KD qualified, and so you're going to have a trough for a couple of years until the system gets up and running. We need to project 8 years ahead and say this is what this is going to do to qualified officers to be able to go in battalion command because we're going to have these sort of downstream effects. Okay, none of that can happen today. None of that happens today. Okay, and that is, one of the things that we need. We need to start leveraging information technology to be able to help us with understanding the impacts of our decisions. Okay, so when we talk about leveraging technology, that's specifically what we're talking about. So the question is, how do we get from where we are today to there? The Chief and the Secretary have told us that we are to do pilots and prototypes with subgroups of the officer corps, assess their feasibility, and then if they work and if they're value added, scale them to the rest of the Army very rapidly. I'll talk you through some of the things that we're doing right now that are going to start impacting that in a very significant way. So the first one is the Army Talent Alignment process. Some of you are involved with this right now in terms of the building out your position descriptions as well as probably officers who are moving cycle. I'm going to talk to you a lot more detail about that in a couple slides. But it's a whole new way under which we assign officers within the active component. Okay, there's two parts to this. There's the Army Talent Alignment process. Consider that the new assignment process. And then the software that enables that is AIM 2.0. So it's the Army Talent Alignment process enabled by AIM 2.0. That's the software of the marketplace. I'll talk about that in more detail. The second one is this idea of instilling a culture of assessments throughout the entirety of an officer's career. Okay, so let's talk about what the difference is between an evaluation and an assessment. Okay, in our current system is run almost exclusively based on evaluations. That's what your senior rater and your senior rater put. Okay, I commanded 1st Brigade of the 101st, and I was a senior rater to 32 company commanders. I could senior rate them using any sort of idea of how I want to do that. Whether PT was important or not, whether writing skills were important or not. I mean, that is something that was given to me as an authority by the Army based on my years of experience and based on their sort of judgment that I could exercise that. That's always going to be a part of the system. It's always probably going to be the majority of how we look at it. But the fact of the matter is you can also bring in assessments. And assessments are an objective reading of an officer in order to start identifying those skills that they either have or don't have, and if they don't have, how you start developing it. So what we see this becoming is over the entire span of an officer's career is more assessments added in. So in the beginning, at places like the Captain's Career Course, at places like OBC and other places, that comes in to one, help the officer develop himself or herself. Okay? So I know that I'm not a very good writer. I know I lack a degree of mental flexibility. I've got to work on that. I know these sort of things about me. Okay? And the idea is to work on that development of the officer. Also, we can diagnostically bring that information as an Army. So we can say, MI captains tend to be, this, and we'd like them to be this. We tend to think, they need to do more to work on mental flexibility because it's important to have a mentally flexible intelligence officer for the future. And we can actually start assessing that. Is that the right skill set? So you can start seeing how PME, the professional military education, would change based on the input of that. But the idea is roughly for the first 10 years or so, it's being used for that. But sort of at CGSC and afterwards, we start using the value and the insight from the assessments to help manage that officer, both in their development and in their employment as they go forward. Okay, so it's an extra set of information. The other thing that's really important about assessments is for you to understand is the nature of how you can use assessments to drive positive behavior across the entire Army and have you develop the skill sets you want to have. So every one of you in this room is familiar with a particular type of assessment. You do it every 6 months. It's called the Army Physical Fitness Test. Every 6 months, you objectively are going to be measured on how many push-ups you can do, how many sit-ups you can do, and how fast you can run 2 miles. You train your body to excel on that every single time. Okay? And you know that no matter if you take that APFT in Kuwait or Korea or Kaiserslautern, you all pretty much got the same results. And you know what the difference between a 210 on an APFT is versus a 297. Okay? And you know that there's probably not a whole lot of reasons why someone who should be getting a 297 is getting a 210. Like, you understand how these things are done. Okay? That drives us to do a bunch of stuff. We're very comfortable with it in the physical space. But the interesting thing is, think about how different it makes you. I would argue if you took the average 30-year-old American and you contrasted it against the average 30-year-old soldier, 3 areas that we would be well outside the norm of the American population is our ability to do push-ups, sit-ups, and run 2 miles. Because you've trained yourself to be good in those events. So similarly with assessments, we can, as an Army, start identifying those skill sets we want to have within our officer corps, and then hold people to a group of assessments to get them there. Whether that's writing capabilities or verbal communication skills and others. It's a way of collectively getting an uplift from the Army by the way you sort of build your assessments into the system. The first big step we're doing with that is we're introducing the GRE into the Captain's Career Course. All captains now at the Captain's Career Course have to take a GRE. Okay? We're using it to use the GRE in order to have the officer corps work on their critical thinking skills. That's one. And then we're going to use the GRE to help determine which officers we should send to advanced civil schooling or not. Because the GRE is designed to figure out how well you're going to do in the first year of a master's degree program. Okay? We may in the future use the GRE as part of the selection criteria for officers to go to CGSC. That's not been decided yet. Okay? We're not going to use the GRE to decide who should be a battalion commander, because the GRE isn't designed to help find battalion commanders. The GRE is designed to help put you in an advanced civil schooling sort of environment. It's an educational measure. Okay? So as we're doing this, we're also going to start developing those assessment tools that are going to start looking at the skills we want to have in future senior leaders, so we can measure and benchmark where officers are in their development as they become more and more senior. And then over time, it's going to play a role in either how they're developed or how they're employed and put into assignments. The final piece of the 2 final ones is flexible career paths. As you know, there's been this time-based system that I think is still going to continue to exist for some time now, because it's actually very hard to manage a large cohort of people not using time as at least one of the factors. Okay, but we're trying to make it a little less rigid. So the first step is embracing the authority that Congress gave us in August of 2018, and they said you can have officers opt out of promotion boards. Okay, so the laws and the policy is written in such a way that says if you're doing something that's of significant value to the United States Army, and you need some flexibility in your career timeline, you can send up a request to opt out of a promotion board. We're going to make a standard for all promotion boards. We're actually going to do it for the Captain's Board. Not a whole lot of need for people to do it, but just to instill that in it. The first time we did it was for the Lieutenant Colonel's Board just recently. Okay? And the idea for that is, and I think captains make the best sort of example. Like, let's say you're a captain who's an instructor pilot down at Fort Rucker. The Army wants you to continue to develop your proficiency as an aviator. So we want you to stay in the cockpit and be an instructor pilot. And that's also benefiting the future pilots we're growing. But you want to spend a couple more years there before you go to CGSC and before you go and try to get KD qualified. So instead of being in a rush to jam through all those gates, you can go back a year or 2 years in order to develop your skills as a pilot. So when you show up, you're a better aviator when you show up in your next unit. You can see how this would be helpful for those officers who opt to go to West Point, who then go get a master's degree, they've got a utilization tour, who traditionally are always sort of jammed up in terms of getting out of CGSC, showing up at their units, and having to get KD qualified units. This is a way for them to take a little bit more control, a little bit more ownership. Their preference can actually work in terms of how they want to gauge and move their career forward. So that's a significant change, and it's a first step to us figuring out how we can do something else, which might be how we can have officers choose to opt into promotion boards. So you would be able to control the timing and the flow of that a little bit more individually. You may want to stay a captain for a little while longer because you want to do a couple jobs as a captain that you are never going to get an opportunity to do as a major. And that might be okay. So we're trying to figure out how to set up a system to do that. The final one is promotions and selections. Promotions still based on a whole lot of law, so there's a lot of scrutiny. Selections, interestingly, largely reside under the authority of the Chief of Staff of the Army, so we get some flexibility with selections, not so much with promotions. And I'm going to talk a lot about selections when I talk to you about the Battalion Commander Assessment Program, which I think most of you have heard about. Next slide. So you should know that in August of 2018, the largest change since 1980, when the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act was enacted, largest set of changes coming from Congress to the services in terms of how we can manage our officer corps with a degree of more flexibility. Okay, so I'll walk you through these very quickly. So the first one is the repeal of the age limit. So you can now come into the Army. It used to be if you came in the Army, you had to come in at such an age that you had to be able to do 20 years and be younger than 62, because 62 is the mandatory retirement age. Okay, here's a little piece of personnel trivia for you. Okay, and if you know this answer, because you've heard me say this before, don't answer it. But in what war did the Army adopt 62 as the mandatory retirement age? Best guess. Just guess a war. Korean War? What else? Vietnam War? What else? Who said Civil War? Yeah, so it was the Civil War. So the Army has been running with a mandatory 62-year age, retirement age since the Civil War. So we just changed it. So I know I'm a heretic to think that we may have learned something about how to manage people since the Civil War, but glad to see we're finally inculcating those changes. So that also helps us with the next one, which is direct commissioning up to the level of 06. We used to have direct commissioning up to 03. Congress said you can now bring in up to colonels, people directly in from the outside world. Okay? It's a way for us to start getting after this issue in terms of where the skill sets sort of reside, and you know, you can start seeing it. You can start bringing in people who are leaders of industry in order to come into our Army and help us make us better with all of these technologies that we just don't have resonant within our formations. Did I do the civilian versus military already with you guys, or is this I did already? Okay. But yeah, you can see how that will help us. So when this came out, the Chief and the Secretary said all branches, all functional areas are open for us to be able to do this. And I pushed back to the Chief at the time, it was General Milley, and I said, sir, you certainly don't want us to direct commission in infantry officers. And he said, the British, the French, the Germans, the Australians, they all make fantastic infantry officers, as do other countries. If you can find a qualified infantry officer from there who wants to come and join our Army, we'd be lucky to add them to our formations and we'd be better for it. So if that's the attitude for infantry, I can safely say that all the branches and functional areas are still on the table in terms of being able to bring them in. Next is brevet promotions. Something the Navy's been doing for quite some time. They call them spot promotions. We're going to take an Army name to it. It's called brevet promotions. So a brevet promotion means this. Congress has given us 770 authorizations to use from captain to colonel. Now let's just use a colonel's example. You can have a position that is traditionally held by a colonel. You can identify it as a brevet promotable position. And then a lieutenant colonel can be part of the applications for that position as a colonel. If the hiring authority hires that lieutenant colonel, because that hiring authority thinks that lieutenant colonel is the best qualified for that position, that lieutenant colonel sends his or her package back to the G1, to the Pentagon. It goes through a quick boarding process, and if he or she passes that process, they get promoted to colonel immediately, as long as they're in that job. So as soon as they occupy that position, they are promoted and paid as a colonel, and they continue that rank as long as they stay in that position. So in this example, you're going to start seeing brevet colonels who are at the colonel's board competing for permanent promotion to colonel under this new system. Okay? It's something the Army's done for a long time, it just hasn't done it recently. What we did is, with the new Army Talent Alignment process, we identified 225 positions in this movement cycle, and over the next year we're going to expand it out to the full 770 authorizations. It doesn't mean that those positions will always be filled by people who get brevet promotions, but it means the opportunity is there in order to recognize those who are best qualified to go to a position. Next is merit-based promotion list. So the system as it has operated, and I'll explain it to you because I know there's some junior officers here, is the way it is worked in the past, and this was based on law, is the Army would hold a promotion board. And let's just say it's those majors. And we would identify 2,150 majors for promotion from the rank of captain. And there was an order of merit list that went 1 to 2,150. And so we had ranked and stacked everyone's file. And then when it came time for us to actually promote people, we said we're not going to base it on how strong their files are. We're going to do it based on their date of rank, as if date of rank has anything to do with it, right? That was what the law said. And so you would promote the oldest officers first and the most junior officers last. So if you were one of that top 3 to 5% that was promoted below the zone, you generally got promoted in the very last month of that entire sequence. Okay? Which, you know, it was great to be picked up easy, but it really didn't make all that big of a difference in terms of what. I mean, it was a nice pat in the back, but it made no difference in terms of anything. So what Congress said is you don't have to do that. You can do that strictly based on the order of merit list. Okay, and so we went and considered a whole bunch of options. So one option was we were just going to go strictly based on the order of merit list. Okay, we were just going to go, here's the majors list. On the beginning of the list, we promote number 1. On the very last of the month, end of the list, at the end of this, after a year, we're going to promote 2,150. And we said we thought that was not a good idea for a couple of reasons. One, we thought it would break down the spirit of competitive cooperation amongst the officer corps, so it would become a little bit more cutthroat than we would like it to be. And then secondly, we thought that officers would end up being stigmatized when they showed up if you could just look at their date of rank. And you could imagine units starting to say, like, don't send me an officer that was promoted after the 1st of July because I don't want anyone on the bottom half of this list. Like, that's not the officers we want to have in this organization. Plus, you could just look at somebody as a senior rater based on their date of rank, and you could potentially already know that, like, that person was lower, and you might be stigmatized. So for all those reasons, we said that's not it. And so we said, let's do a hybrid. Let's see if we can do a combination. Promote a chunk of the list off of the order of merit list, off the high performers, and a chunk of the list off the data rank. And I highlight this because this becomes interesting in terms of the way we've done things and the way we're going to start doing things. Okay, it's starting to move into the information age a little bit. Okay, but I'm going to contrast the two approaches. So as we sat down there with the practitioners who are looking at actually exercising this and how we're going to do this as an Army, their first answer was, okay, we'll do this hybrid, and we'll promote 15% of the top 15% of the list every single time. And I said, well, 15% is a pretty good number, but my favorite number in the whole wide world is 17.12%. Can we promote 17.12% of the list every time? And they said, that's a little goofy, but okay, 17.12, like we all agree 17.12. And I said, okay, I just changed my mind. I know it's a little bit weird, but my new favorite number is 12.13. Can we promote 12.13% off of every list? And they said, okay, fine, like stop it. Like, okay, 12.13, we're all in agreement, it's 12.13. And I said, fellas, you're missing the point. Like those numbers are completely arbitrary. 12.13, 17.12, 15%, they're all arbitrary. Okay? Let's do something a little bit more advanced. Let's actually run the data. Let's determine what the top cluster is, and let's let every board be unique based on where the data takes you. Okay? It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all, just sort of 15%. And so they said, well, that means every board is going to have different results in terms of those who are in the top cluster. And I said, that's exactly right. And that's okay, because it's actually much more accurate in terms of representing who are the top cluster. And so we just did this for the first time for the majors. And what you saw is, amongst the different 4 subcategories, the range was about 17 and 19% were identified in that top cluster. Those officers were promoted earlier, based on their OML, and then it reverted over to date of rank and then they executed for the rest of it. And so you'll see this for all branches now, all promotion boards going forward. You'll see a portion that are based off of the sort of top cluster of high performers, and then you'll see those who are based off of date of rank. So that's a great new authority we've been given. Next is opting out of a promotion board. I think I talked to you that a little bit, but up to 2 years, significant value, approved by the Assistant Secretary of the Army. We now have the ability to extend officers to 40 years time in service from captain to colonel. They have to be extraordinary in some way, but we have now the ability to extend officers longer. And then we have an alternate promotion authority by which the secretary can take a subgroup of the officer corps and say, I want these people to be looked at as their own subgroup or population because they're unique and different, and I want them to be treated sort of specially. So let's just say that the secretary can say, I want to consider all lieutenant colonel PhD candidates, and I want to put them in a group so we can look at them a little differently, so they're not disadvantaged by looking at people who have more traditional operational jobs. Okay, and then we have the reserve officers not considered for promotions about the management of the IRR, and then federal recognition, which deals with this discrepancy between when the states recognize a promotion or promote somebody and when the federal government recognizes it. For all of these, we've been given the mission of writing the policy and overseeing the initial execution of this as we go forward. You can see some of these are some significant changes. Next slide. I want to talk you through now for the two big initiatives that we have folded out. So the first one is the Army Talent Alignment process. Think of this as the replacement to the Army assignment system as you have known it in the past. Next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to read these all to you, but these are agreed upon principles of the Army Talent Alignment process as agreed upon by the Chief and the Secretary. Okay, and really what it talks about is the centrality of using AIM 2 to get everyone to start working in this regulated marketplace to be able to do this. It talks about readiness determining what jobs are coming open, just as we always have in the past. I'll describe that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. We talk about how readiness and professional development and senior leader guidance are going to determine eligibility for roles of assignment, but we've also tried greatly to break up much of the rigidity which we've given officers' career paths. We've had a series of meetings with every branch and functional area, commandant or proponent lead, in order to try to eliminate some of the things. So if you're an infantry officer, you can go light. Okay, that's sort of the biggest example. You can leave the captain's career course and potentially go be an assistant PMS at an ROTC program. You don't need to go immediately right to a job if there's a job open and you're well qualified for it. These are the types of things, and there's really a lot of talk about how we make this system more transparent for all officers involved. We're also using this to incentivize officers. So when I talked about the 225 brevet promotions that are available, we have given a chunk of those to hard-to-fill locations, specifically Korea, NTC, and JRTC. The people sometimes just don't, and it's sometimes harder to get people to go there. So now we found a way, instead of forcing people to go there, to at least begin a process of incentivizing them to go there if they're well qualified for those positions. Next slide. So within the ATAP, and this is a very complicated chart, but I'll sort of talk you through from left to right. Okay, on the left-hand side, all I really need to know is that the Army has a system by which they figure out which positions are going to be filled within the Army. Because we always have more open positions than we have people to fill it, and we have to go through a prioritization process. Okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but if you're a unit, you've been told that you're going to be able to man at 80%, and you've got 100 open positions. This is the way by which units say, these are the 80 positions I want to have filled. Here are the 20 I don't want to have filled. And there's this back and forth that happens. That still happens like in the old system as in the new system. And those are the jobs that come and become available in AIM 2 for a moving officer to be able to see. I highlight that because I continue to hear people say, well, because this is all sort of preference-based, you're going to have like infantry battalions that don't have battalion S3s because everyone wants to go be a speechwriter in Hawaii. That's not really the case. We're going to have enough people, if the job is important enough for the Army to be identified, it's going to come into the assignment process, but there'll also be officers identified against it. So we're not going to have battalion S3 positions unfilled because people don't want to be battalion S3s. Two things that are different are the roles of the individuals and the role of the officer. So as an individual officer, you need to describe yourself in the backside of your ORB. It's an opportunity for you to get past a sort of very structured format in the front and just describe yourself uniquely in the back in terms of what makes you unique. You also have to list out references and contacts so you can have units contact them and get to help in the hiring process. If you're a unit, you've got to take the position, you've got a duty description, then you've got to list out the knowledge, skills, behaviors. So we start getting a framework by which we can look at what sort of knowledge, skills, behaviors do we want to have in each of these positions so we can better manage the officer corps. Now, when the market opens, and it's open right now, it's been open for about a month right now, what happens is you enter into your own, I mean, you can see all jobs, but you enter into your own unique marketplace. The average size of a marketplace for a moving officer is about 80 jobs. There's some big ones. If you're an MI captain, I think it's like 450 jobs are out there. Okay, so you got a lot of choices, but you get to see everything. There are none of these jobs that are now hidden behind by an assignment officer who's keeping away from you because they don't think you're well qualified for it. Like, you get to see everything. If you're a colonel and you want to go try to be the chief of staff in the Army's XO, it's advertised in there. Okay? You can try to market yourself in order to do that. Okay? The idea is there's almost complete transparency. There are a couple branches that aren't in it right now, specifically the JAG Corps, for some legal issues. But other than that, those jobs are out there. Well, it's a lot. I can answer this question if you want to, but like, we're not sure we can legally actually have the JAG Corps go in there because there's a unique assignment authority that exists within the head JAG, General PD. So when you get in there, though, as a moving officer, you can see every job that is available for you. Units can then see all the officers that are available. Okay, they can see the backside of your ORB. They can find out who your references are. They can contact them. They can contact you. They can have an interview process. And at the end of this, and we're getting close to the end of this because the 27th, the market's going to close down for officers, okay? You have the opportunity, or you should, go and preference all of your assignments, okay? So you get to list 1 to however far you want to go down in your preference list in order to see where you want to go. Units will then take a look at all the candidates and they'll preference those officers that they want to have come to their units 1 to as low as they want to go. Okay, if you're a unit or if you are an individual, I strongly, strongly encourage you to preference as deeply as possible on both sides. Because as long as there is preference for us to base these decisions on, we'll continue to use the preferences of each of the individuals or of the units. But if there is no preference, then we go back to like having HRC sort of put you in a position. Or if you're a unit and you have a preference, the HRC is going to give you somebody, and you're losing your chance to influence the entire process. Okay? Because when the market closes and we've got their preferences, we'll start doing this matching. But the thing that becomes the first consideration is the preference of the individual officer. Okay? So a few rules associated with this is if an individual officer puts a unit number 1 and the unit puts the individual as number 1, that should be unbreakable. It's only unbreakable if there's something like a Married Army's Couple Program issue, which you should have worked through before, or an EFMP issue, which you probably should have worked through as well before. Okay? But like that's not going to be broken, if there's that 1-to-1 match. And then it continues to go down. If you don't get your first choice because the unit preferred someone else higher, then it goes second, third, and so. But it's units preference first and second. We've got an 8-minute video that describes how this system runs. I strongly recommend you sit down and take a look because it runs you through all the different scenarios of how this can look for a officer who's in that movement. But again, your individual preference as an officer is the first consideration that is used. So it's a great new tool, and you've got an opportunity to really maximize that. At the end of this, we're going to get a new slate of where 14,000 officers in this movement cycle are going to go. Okay? We're going to stop as soon as we've generated that, and we're going to do some analysis on what this slate looks like. We're going to make sure we haven't disadvantaged any locations. Okay? We're going to make sure that we haven't that commanders have actually exercised their hiring authority correctly and are just not hiring, left-handed, green-eyed people who look like them. Okay? Because the trust is that commanders are going to exercise this authority appropriately. And then we're going to try to do and make some checks to make sure that the commanders are not just hiring people who've worked for them for the past. Okay? And in this, what we are doing is we are trusting in colonels and above to exercise this authority responsibly. Okay? We're going to see what data we get from that. And then we may have to make adjustments as we go along. But for the first time ever, we're going to actually have all this information together and we can look at all these things. Okay? Because remember back in the beginning I talked about us moving from data poor to data rich. This is a huge step forward to us being able to bring all this information together about our officer corps and be able to start managing our officers very, very differently, seeing ourselves very, very differently in terms of that. Next slide, please. So it is important for everybody to understand in terms of what we're going to gain collectively. So if you're an individual officer, you're now involved in a system where you have complete transparency and your preference matters. Okay, let me give you a quick data point in terms of how big this is. If every officer, all 14,000 officers who were involved in this movement cycle, preferred every single job that they were available for, there would be a total of 1.2 million potential preferences that could be submitted. Already, about 2 weeks out from its closure, we have more than 700,000 preferences registered by all the moving officers. Okay, so I don't think we're going to get to 1.2 million. But just think about it, 700,000 preferences have already been submitted and now are being managed through this system. So units are going to gain transparency. It's not just going to be June or July occurs and 40 officers show up on a brigade's doorstep and you didn't really know who that was going to be. You've got ownership of what this is, and you've got ownership of who you're bringing into your team. Okay? There was a sort of rumor that went out at one point that said that a bunch of BCT commanders were sort of complaining about this and said that they don't want to have to do this and they wish HRC would just take care of it for them. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Army's answer at the time, who's now our Chief of Staff of the Army, he said, tell me the name of the 5 BCT commanders because the Army's picking the wrong leaders for that position if that's their attitude. Okay, so we didn't give him the 5 names. But that's how serious he's taking this in terms of the hiring authority that he has pushed down to brigade level commanders and the expectation that it's going to be handled very responsibly. Again, and then units are able to improve their readiness. The Army is going to gain a tremendous amount of information, both from the individual level to the institutional level about what makes up our officer corps. Just by doing the self-professed knowledge, skills, behaviors on the back, we're going to learn a lot more about what our officer corps is, and we can use that to better manage our officer corps in all sorts of different ways. From the unit duty description, we're going to start getting over time. What really are the skills that we want to have in these positions? How common are they? And then how does our PME then relate to the development of those skills so we've actually got a PME that's related to what the demand is amongst the units in order to have it. And we can actually now show this with a high degree of fidelity in order to drive this. I mean, the amount of information we get this is going to be pretty crucial. Okay, so that's it for the ATAP. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about the Battalion Commander Assessment Pilot. Okay, just raise your hand if you haven't heard about the Battalion Commander Assessment Pilot. Okay, what ranks you guys like, lieutenants and stuff? That's right. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things the chief asked us to do is take a look at how we promote and select. Okay, and what we quickly started taking a look at is how we select battalion commanders. Why battalion command? Battalion command is a really important decision we make as an Army. Okay, it's an important decision we make as an Army for a couple of reasons. So first off, it's got a significant impact for how we train and fight our Army. Okay, battalion commander is a critical position for that. It's also one of the first big screens and sort of the first major cuts we make in terms of putting people on the path to strategic leadership. The vast majority of all general officers and all colonels have commanded at the 05 level. Okay, and then also, and you guys all know this as well as I do, it plays a huge role in the retention of our best, soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers. And battalion command is absolutely critical. You've been in battalions that are well commanded by great battalion commanders and not well commanded by not good battalion commanders. I mean, the difference is night and day. And so we said, what is the Army doing systemically to pick the very best from within our ranks? And when you take a look at it, the system that we have been executing looks like this. A central board is convened. Every board member takes a look at every file, generally about 1,200 files or so. They spend a minute to 2 minutes looking at every file, and what they do is they look at the ORB, they look at the photo, they look at the last 4 OERs, and they give that file a score, and then they move to the next one. Okay? That score is then aggregated together and averaged out. And then we find the top group of the people, and they put them in a battalion command, and the rest of them become alternates, and then some people, are on neither of those lists. Okay? So what we found out is actually that when a board member is looking at your OERs, all they really look at is the block check on your senior rater comments and the first and last sentence of your senior rater comments. So what we came away with when we actually added this all up is that most tweets contain more characters than your OER has, a number of characters that actually determine whether you're going to be promoted or selected. Okay, and so we asked ourselves, is this the very best way that the Army can pick a battalion commander? And what the chief started saying is, the Ranger Regiment spends more time assessing and selecting a private for the Ranger Regiment than we do as an Army assessing and selecting battalion commanders. So can we do something different? So, next slide. We can, in this sort of idea of how we're supposed to do this, we did a pilot down at Fort Benning in June and July. We took 26 officers off the alternate list, so not the primary guys, but the alternate list, but they had an established OML through that process I just described to you. And we put them through a 5-day assessment. And one of the first things that was interesting is there were 26 officers who were invited to come, said, if you want to be a battalion commander, you've got to go through this. 3 of them came back and said, I don't want to be a battalion commander. Okay, so that was down to 23. And so we ran 23 of these officers through this 5-day process. And there was this screening piece, so some people were deemed ready for command and some people were deemed not ready for command. And then there was a different scoring mechanism that we ran in order how to do that, based on really 3 things for this piece. For this piece, the order of merit was based on how they did in the APFT, how they did in the writing test, and how they did in the cognitive test. Those are the 3 things that we used to score. We're going to do it differently with the one we do for record in January. Okay, and so what we found out after we ran everybody through this, and we also took in 4 people off the primary list in July and ran them through to see how people high off the primary list would compete against people on the alternate list. And what we found was pretty interesting. Next slide. So first off, we found that when we went through this, 5 out of the 23 alternates didn't pass this overall assessment. Okay, so 2 didn't pass height weight test. Okay, 1 was screened out for being a toxic leader, and 2 were screened out for not being cognitively capable of commanding a battalion, based on the collective assessment. Okay? And so we said, okay, let's, and then we brought in the 4 primaries, and the 4 primaries did fine, they all passed, thank God. But when you actually ran a different scoring rubric, they actually did score 1, 2, 3, and 4. They scored 2, 3, 7, and 13. So someone who was in the very top of the list off the primary list was number 13 out of 27. And so we said, and then the thing that was really interesting is when we asked every member who had gone through this, what they thought of it, every single person who was a candidate through this process said this is a better way to pick battalion commanders. All 7 general officers who sat on the interview panel said this is a better way to pick battalion commanders. Okay? And faced with that information, Chief of Staff of the Army decided that we were going to execute what he calls the Battalion Commander Assessment Program in January. So I want to focus a little bit on this and tell you what the events are, and so you can understand a little better. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, so is there anybody here who's actually going to go to BCAP as a candidate? All right, great. And is there anyone out here, show me your hands, who have been hit up with these surveys, the Army Commander Evaluation Tool? That's great. Hey, fill those things out, okay? So let me just talk about that for a second. The Army is saying that peer and subordinate feedback is relevant information for us to fold into how we pick battalion commanders as an Army. Okay? About 2.5 weeks ago, we sent out 26,000 of these surveys to be filled out. We looked at a candidate and we said, we're going to find your peers, we're going to find your subordinates, you provide us the information. So we sent out 26,000. About 2,500 of them came back and said, look, I don't know this person, because you sort of said we were the same brigade, but I didn't know this person who's in it, that's fine. But when you then get down to 23,500 actually valid ones, I think we've had more than 13,000 filled back and complete. So we're like above 60% completion rate right now. If you're still sitting on one, please get those things filled in because they're really, really important. It is the largest attempt by the Army to gather peer and subordinate feedback for us to make a decision. Okay, and you're part of that. Okay, so here's what's happened and what's gonna happen. So the Central Selection Board met in September. There were 1,135 officers who opted to try to come in and be a battalion commander. Okay, so the board met, they reviewed all the files as we've always done, and they rank ordered them from number 1 to 1,135. And we said, within every branch and functional area, we're going to figure out how many primary alternates and then an excess in order to do it. So let's just say infantry. It was 50 infantry battalion commands, I think. And then we said an alternate list of 25, so that gets you to 75, plus an excess of like 10, which gets you to like 85. And so we went and found the top 85 infantry officers on that list, and they got included. Okay, did the same thing for cyber and everybody else. Okay, that got us to 816 candidates who were notified a couple weeks ago that they need to report in to Fort Knox between the 15th of January and the 9th of February to go through this 5-day assessment program. Okay? So, they're going to show up and they're going to go through a series of events. Okay, and this is, everyone should know this information. So the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to take a height weight test. All right? So that's no surprise. Next day they're going to take an APFT. Again, no surprise. They're going to then do a series of assessments. They're going to do a writing assessment. They're going to do a psychological assessment, or fill in the blanks questionnaire. And they're going to do a cognitive, non-cognitive assessment. The next day, they're going to go before an interview with a psychologist who's trained in assessments and selections. Okay, so an Army psychologist. And they're going to have that one-on-one. The final event they're going to do over the next couple days is they're going to come and they're going to have a panel interview. The panel is going to be made up of a 2-star general, 2 1-star generals, and 2 former brigade commanders. Okay, but it's going to be a different interview process. It's going to be different than what we normally do. So all the literature and all the studies on interviews say that the least effective way to figure out how you're going to make a hiring decision is to have an interview with them. Because all the studies say you bring a candidate in, you shake their hand, you make an initial impression on that person, and for the next 30 minutes of the interview, all you're doing is confirming your bias of your initial, what they call introductory bias. Okay? So for the Army, what that looks like is, does he or she have a Ranger tab, the right combat patch, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So we want to eliminate as much bias as possible. And so what will happen is the candidates, you'll have the panel members, they'll have anonymized information about each of the candidates. There'll be a screen that's erected between where the panel members sit and where the panel interviewee, where the candidates come in. Candidates will come in and sit down. They'll be asked a series of questions. Everyone will be asked the same questions on a given day, and they'll be given an opportunity to answer those questions back. Okay? At the end of that, the board members are going to be required to say this person is ready for command or not ready for command. They're also going to have information presented to them from the peers and subordinates and the psychological assessments. That information will be available to the panel members as well. So at the end of all that information, panel members are going to be able to make a ready for command, not ready for command decision. Okay, if an officer is deemed not ready for command, as long as they're still eligible, they're going to be able to recompete the next year. No harm, no foul. Like you're not going to be stigmatized for not passing it. If you do pass it, and you get in that category of having been screened and being put in that category, we're going to recompete the order of merit list, and we're going to use 5 things to grade where you rank on the order of merit list. Okay? So we're going to look at your APFT. We're going to look at your verbal communication scores based on how you did the panel interview. We're going to look at your APFT, verbal communication skills, written communication skills, your cognitive, non-cognitive assessment, and then you're also going to bring forward into your overall grade how you ranked based on your performance on the Central Selection Board. So your past performance is still going to be considered and weighed as you come. It's actually the largest single consideration. That's going to all be combined to establish a whole new order of merit list by which we're going to pick the primary and the alternates for battalion command across the Army. That process is going to happen at Fort Knox from the 15th of January to the 9th of February this year. Okay. As soon as we're done with that, we send that slate to HRC. HRC then takes that list, and then they start making slating determinations of where people are going to go. Okay. I think this is my last slide. Next. Okay. One more, just so you can put that up there. We've got a bunch of links in terms of any information that you would want to find out about these things. We're putting out information papers and publishing videos at a fairly rapid pace, so stay. That's where you can keep abreast of these changes that we're driving. Okay, so I've got some concluding comments when I'm done with questions. So what questions do I have from all you guys? I was going to say, don't tell me about any questions.
So is that ECAP concept going to expand out to other selection boards in the Army, like for the B-level commanding or higher?
Yeah, so the chief has asked us to take a look specifically at how we could do this for a colonel's assessment program. And then I think Sergeant Major Jeremy Grinston is looking at how we can do something like this for sergeant majors. So yeah, I think that's coming. Pre-decisional, no concept approved yet, but that's the direction we're moving right now. And don't know the timeline for that. Okay? Yeah.
Sir, Chapel Grizzle, 18 CSSB. How do you forecast this shift from industrial age to information age? How do you forecast this impacting the officer corps?
Positive.
Promotions, assignments.
So I think a couple of things. I think we're going to start getting a better alignment of talents because we're talking about talents. I think we're going to have a very different discussion about how we manage our officer corps. Let me talk to you about one of the ways we've all seen it manifested, and I don't think we even recognized it, okay? And I think this is where the power of this new system with better information leads us. So all of us, I think most everybody here, remembers over the last 4 years that the creation of the Security Force Assistance Brigades has been a key priority of the Chief of Staff of the Army. Okay, so let's talk about how we did that. Let's just take one subset, okay? You know, we had to put a significant number of infantry captains into Security Force Assistance Brigades. I'm going to use them as an example, but it applies for everybody. And so the chief said, I want high-quality officers going in there. Let's find the very best infantry captains that we have, and let's put them in as Security Force Assistance Brigades. In this data poor environment, what we did is we said, okay, let's take a quick look at their MOP score. So every officer has a MOP score. So they look at your last 5 or 6 OERs, and they give you a score. Okay? And they said, let's grab the top 10%. So if you're a captain and you're eligible to go to an SFAB, what they really looked at is how well you did as a company commander. Okay, if you've ever done advisory work, and I have, our brigade was transitioned from a IBCT to an SFAB in order to go over to Afghanistan in 2013 and 14. I can tell you with assurance that there are great company commanders who would be lousy advisors. And there are great advisors who would be lousy company commanders. Okay? They are sometimes, there is a Venn diagram where there's some that are both, but those are in some ways very different skill sets. Okay? But what the Army said is, let's grab our very best company commanders and let's jam them into becoming advisors. Okay? Now some of those guys probably should never have been advisors, right? Like they probably should have gone to NTC or JRTC, they should have continued to work their craft. Maybe they should have gone to ACS to broaden their horizon, see some stuff. Okay? But when you run your data poor sort of officer system, and you only got 1 or 2 dimensions by which you can look at your officers, you're always going to be in this sort of scarcity for what you're looking for because you don't have enough dimensions. But let's say we've got a future system, okay? Let's say we've got a future system that sees our officer corps in a whole lot of different dimensions, okay? And it could have looked like this. You could have said, let's take just from their performance, top 50% officers, not top 10%. Let's say by assessments, those officers who have demonstrated that they've got high levels of cognitive flexibility. And then let's say we're going to find those officers who on the backside of their ORBs have self-described their behaviors as they like to internationally travel. They're showing an interest with their free time and their own money, how they, what actually motivates them. And in their free time, they travel to foreign lands, interact with other people. I think we would have got a dramatically better cadre of people in to be advisors. And you would have not had to force people who had no desire or inclination to be an advisor. And they could have done those things within the Army. And so you'll see how both on the advisory mission you do better, and then in the other important missions you do as well, because you get a much better talent match of what that can look. So what does that mean? That means people feel more satisfied in their work. It means that they feel like they're contributing aligned with where their desires are. You match that with preference, right? Where all of a sudden people feel like their options are much more under their control. And I think what you get is a more effective officer corps that's staying in at higher numbers in order to continue to contribute to the system that they now have a lot more ownership for. So that's my hope. That's where I think we're driving all this. And then further, because now we've got information about our officer corps, we can manage them a whole lot differently. Okay? We can actually make data-informed decisions about things as opposed to instinct-based decisions, which is sometimes the way we still revert back to doing it. What other questions? Yeah.
Sir, just a question about key development time. Any impacts to it, or based on branch, will there still be required gates that you have to hit as an officer?
I think we are still going to have, under any system, like, there might be more flexibility, but there still needs to be this definition of what things you need to do at each grade to sort of make sure you've done the right things. And I can see that being much more flexible, but I still think, you would have to do that. Now, like one of the things I think is under consideration. Let me just do this by a show of hands. I love doing this. I already know which way this is going to go, but I just like to see it every time because it's sort of stark. 2 options here. Option 1 is what we do right now, which we say every captain in the Army must command a company. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance to vote. Option 2 is Some captains have to command a company, some get a chance to go on a career path or a career field where they do not have to command a company, and that's okay. So who thinks we should make every captain command a company? And who thinks we should make it so not all captains have to command a company? Yeah, it happens every single time. And generally, it is just the more senior people who think everybody. So I think that's one of the areas where we may start looking at some degree of flexibility on pieces like that. But I still think, you know, even within that, maybe you don't have to command a company, you have to do a couple of things to get sort of qualified at your grade, I think. Okay? What other questions we have?
Hey, sir. Major Mike Gomez, just a question. You're talking about realigning, and my question is V-tipping. So let's say you've got someone who's a computer science engineer or something out of college. They end up stuck in a branch that maybe they're not happy with, and it's a very tight branch, and I say that it's under strength. And then they have an opportunity for like cyber warfare or something like that, but their branch isn't going to let them go because they can't. Are we looking at, is the Army looking at, hey, this guy's a very particular skill set and can do very well, we'll have a better job, we'll more likely to stay in the Army 20, 30, 40 years and can perform at that level? Is that being looked at also?
It is. So, I mean, so the short answer is yes. I mean, we've got to figure out a way in which we can better align those sort of pieces, and the whole mechanism for that sometimes prevent that lateral sort of movement of. It is not something that we're like hitting immediately, but it's definitely on the radar screen as we go further along this sort of road. Okay, I'm going to ask. Okay, if you're a lieutenant or a captain, I'm going to ask you a question. Okay, and I've never done this. I'm going to show of hands. Just be interested in what your opinions are on this. And again, non-attributional. Just trying to get a sense of it. How many of you, if you had an opportunity to re-branch based on what you know now, as opposed to what you knew when you were at you know, ROTC or West Point, how many of you would want an opportunity to change your branch that you got commissioned with when you were second lieutenant? Show me your hands. Yeah. Okay, just as a show of hands, how many of you would not? Okay. Yeah, so it's, I mean, if I was just to do a quick read, it's sort of more still happy with their branch, but a significant number would probably want to have a little bit of flexibility in terms of what. That's interesting. Okay, great. What else? What other questions do I have? Yep.
Sarah Major Zimmerman, 709th MP Battalion. So we talk about managing talent at the big Army level, right? Mm-hmm. And then you alluded to a little bit of battalion commanders and their ability to rate, like you said, like 26, 32 lieutenants. What tools or how are we synthesizing the outbriefs that we know the attrition of a lot of our officers get out between that 5-year mark? How are we synthesizing that by teaching battalion commanders or senior leadership how to actually manage talent at the low level? How are we doing that?
It's, I mean, so I think it's that's a really good question. I have done this speech so many times at this point, I don't get that many different sort of questions. That's one of them, so good job. So I think part of it is something we need to start changing. So first off, I would say at the junior officer level, we need to start, so think about all the pieces that we need to start developing for this. So first off, we as an Army need to say, here is the type of talents that we want to keep in our Army for the next 10, 15 years. Okay? So we're not even doing that right now. Okay? And then we've got to backtrack who has the potential to have those sort of talents, or who has talents already, and backtrack to them and see if we can find that information. And then I think we need to then sort of complement that with the information that the units have in order to like help direct them. So you may be in charge of 32 lieutenants, and you may have within your formation 5 that have been identified as the Army as probably unique in terms of us wanting to prioritize them to be able to do that. That's all stuff we're trying to look at how you would do that system, right? And the problem is it's a little bit different from the way we've usually been raised, right? Because it's all sort of, all officers are sort of all the same. This egalitarian spirit that we have within the Army is generally a good thing, but sometimes it robs us from being able to make those sort of qualitative cuts. But I would argue 3 years into an officer's career, you've got 4 years of ROTC or West Point, data on them. It's different, obviously, for your OCS. You've got OBC data on them, and then you've got 3 or 4 years worth of performance in the units. You're starting to get a pretty good picture. Maybe not, maybe at that point we're not, I know we're not looking like picture next Chief of Staff of the Army in 30 years, but we could probably say, okay, these officers probably are going to be in the top 50% of their cohort, and they're probably worthy of some form of additional focus and attention working through the chain of command with that. And we're trying to figure out what that model looks like. But I think the other piece is, part of this is battalion commanders starting to understand that's part of their responsibility. I mean, one of the things we're looking at doing is trying to see if, if you get a distribution of officers, how do we look at senior raters in terms of how well they did about retaining the most qualified and the most talented? Right? I mean, if all of a sudden senior raters, and here's the thing, because I've looked at this for quite a while, the decision to stay or get out of the Army is a multifactorial decision. Right? It's generally not just for one thing. It's not just because you had a bad boss. It's not just because your spouse wanted it. It's not just because you didn't like your ranch. There's generally a whole bunch of things that come together. But there should be some recognition that there's a role that leadership can play in this, and maybe we start having some more visibility on how, either through tools or just putting visibility on the role of commanders to be able to do that. And we're trying to find out what that model looks like, and at the same time do it, I think, equitably and fairly and responsibly. Okay, does that answer your question? Good.
So my name is Captain Lloyd. I'm an OC down at JMRC. I'm curious, you mentioned within ATAP that the preferences would matter. How does that work in the thinking of like a bell curve at a post? So for example, if all of us here in the room are going to move and we put our preferences as Hawaii, Germany, Fort Carson, Fort Lewis, and then those commanders in turn are picking the best ones, how does the Army manage that and say, hey, we still have to fill Korea, Fort Bliss, Fort Polk, maybe places that aren't traditionally requested, and in turn, with this talk of transparency, does somebody come back and tell you, hey, you were handpicked as the #1 dude by this commander to go to your first choice of post, or do they say, hey man, you may want to go here, but you're going to be cannon fodder for somebody's profile? Or in turn, is there an incentive to say, hey, we'll send you to Korea because not a lot of people want it?
You can't hit me with 4 questions simultaneously. Yeah, so no, just stand. So for the first question was, how do we maintain a qualitative distribution across units? So it's one of the things we're going to take a look at, and we're going to try to make sure we don't unintentionally disadvantage any of those. But here's the thing though, and here's where it's really interesting, and this is one of the symptoms of being a data poor environment. Okay, let's just say a TRADOC unit versus an operational unit. I'm going to keep on standing because all your questions are really good. I want to get to every one of them. Okay, so like someone coming out of company command may have been not a very good company commander, but could in fact be an excellent instructor. Right? Like that possibility exists. And so that person could be a TRADOC and could be a really, really good instructor and could be, knocking it out of the park doing that. The current system we have in terms of performance distribution wouldn't necessarily have that visibility on that officer because they would have sort of like, middling of the road sort of OERs. And so performance distribution is not the same thing as talent distribution, right? And what we're trying to get to a system is you find those people who would be really good instructors and you put them in instructor positions. You find those people who would be really good commanders and you keep them in sort of commander positions and you broaden them out as well. So that's, but specifically Korea, JRTC, Fort Bliss, some of the certain NTC, some of the least popular places geographically for us to be able to put people. We're going to take a hard look at that. Here's the other thing though, and this is where it's really interesting. In our Army, and I didn't realize this, I think I did it, but I didn't fully realize this. Our current system up until now has never assigned officers to units. You were assigned to an installation. Like, so there was a tranche of officers that would show at Fort Campbell and then get distributed down. And so it'll be interesting to see what behaviors change when you're not just going to, Fort Campbell, but you're going to go to 1st Brigade, okay? And you're going to be actually working for it. And I think if you've got leaders in places like Fort Polk in Korea that are reaching out to individual officers and saying, I want you to come to my formation because I think you're unique and you're going to be a great fit here, I think you'll start seeing some distribution of talent and performance that maybe we hadn't expected because now it's such a fundamentally different. And it's one of the things we're going to take a look at. The other thing, when it starts coming to about like your preferences and how you get this, it's one of the things you need to start messaging to your friends. If you've got 400 assignments that are open and you've preferenced all 400 positions and you get your 150th choice, yeah, that's not the end of the world. It's actually not half bad, right? But I mean, but the options are, do you want to see everything and then be able to get your 150th choice, or do you want to see 3 assignments and get 1 of 3? Right? And so one is much greater ownership of your own career and how you can do that. But it is going to be different. Like everyone's not going to get their first choice. Some people aren't going to get their, aren't going to get their first 100 choices. Okay? And that's going to be okay. But at a certain point, that should be sending you a message too, right? Like if you're consistently getting your 399th out of 400 choice, and you get that repeatedly, I think the Army's sending you a pretty clear message about the utility of your skill sets within the Army. Okay, so that was one. What was the next one?
I think you covered.
Okay, did I get them all? Okay. No, it's a great question, because if you've got it, I'm sure a bunch of other people have it as well. Yeah, in the back.
So you said a recent one I want to have. 1960, the Navy switched to a more promotion board selection based on specialization and technical skills as opposed to tactical competency. Is that something that the military, the Army in particular, is looking at, especially with combat arm branches where, say, for example, in armor branch, we have turret time, airborne units, scouts, and then on top of that with the growing technology, with specialization and skill set going to be more important than, say, like, your tactical expertise as a Army commander?
I'm not sure if I exactly understand the question.
So is like engineers and like specializations within a branch going to be more important, or will we continue to do the broad, like your heavy ones and light next? Or?
So I think what you're going to find is that we are going to allow people to become more specialized if they want to. But there's also got to be a recognition, again, this is all conceptual, is that over time, though, the Army needs you to be broadened. Right? Like, and so in this example, just hypothetically, what we may say is if you're an infantry officer and you want to stay in light units, you can do that and that's fine. But you will go no further than being a battalion commander. Because if we want to make brigade commanders, we expect to have brigade commanders who have experiences in multiple different types of units, because we want to have people who are a little bit more broad. But I think to your point, it's going to be, the tension is going to be how to navigate a degree of specialization and preference, because people may just want to do that, versus the Army's requirement to have people with a broader set of skills so they can utilize them. I think we're trying to find what those models might look like in order to do that, although we haven't gotten a firm course of action on that yet. I think that's coming. What other questions? Yep, right there on the aisle.
Sir, the Rock Park PCRS one. One of the things you mentioned was direct assignment to the unit, something that's not really happening right now, or it's happening, but it's being preempted. Is that legitimately what the plan is? Because at the moment, if lieutenants come in my unit, they may be redlined within USER or 7APC. Is there a preventive measure in that, or will that still?
So I would strongly recommend you read the ATAP X order, okay, because it is very, very clear on that. Okay, so the Army standard is, the Army guidance is, in the X order, is that units are expected to meet 90% of the match. So, if you get sort of technical, at the DMSL level, which means at the brigade level, if you're a moving officer and you have been preferred and you have been, aligned in this process to go to 1st Brigade of 3rd ID, 90% of the officers who have been identified as going to 1st Brigade 3rd ID are supposed to arrive at 1st Brigade of 3rd ID. We did that because we're making units decide in November what the situation is going to be in July, and we allow that there's going to be some fluctuation. People are going to get sick, people are going to quit the Army, positions are going to come open, and the senior mission commanders and their subordinates are going to have a little bit of flexibility, but that's no more than 10% of the population. If they break that, then we're going to be tracking this data. And then the idea is you stay at that DMSL, that brigade level that you were assigned, or you could be a 2-star, it's at whatever level, and you stay there for at least 9 months. And after 9 months, then the senior mission commander on these installations can sort of move you around as you need to. But we're trying to get this to stick, so actually you do it. Because otherwise, if you make units go through all this work, and you make officers go through all this work, and the assignments aren't binding, then no one's gonna do the work. Like, it's just, the system's not gonna work if this can just be like overthrown every time. There's a long negotiated sort of conversation back and forth on what that's supposed to look like. So you're the S1 for what, 2CR? Yeah, so you should, so when you make your slate, you're supposed to run it up, I think in your guys' case, the 7th ATC, you bounce those against each other, they approve it. You should get, I mean, the goal is, we're saying it's a goal, not a standard, because we're trying to figure out how to do this, is 90% of those officers should arrive on your front doorstep. But it does give 7th ATC that 10% to manage issues around. And look, so let's just say between now and July, something dramatic happens, who knows? Who knows what it is? You gotta stand up and do something, or you gotta do, then obviously we take those things into consideration. But for this, we're talking about 90% is what the goal's supposed to be. Okay? That's a good question. What other questions? Yep, right there.
So Lieutenant Colonel Fernia, 18th FD Brigade.
Who's gonna go to the VCAP, right?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. Do you have a date?
Yes, sir, I'm going Section 2 February.
I'll see you then.
What is the stopgap for brigade commanders' ability to choose all top third talent? One of the things, it's not very difficult for us to go into the system right now, and most of us know in our branch is top third talent throughout there when we get into the field grade ranks. So once we're done with the process, what's to stop a brigade commander filling an entire brigade with top third talent? Where HRC used to say, this installation is going to get four bottom third, 1 top third, and 2 middle third officers. So I was just wondering if there's a plan or how that's supposed to work.
Yeah, so first off, if you've got a brigade commander who's only hiring top third officers, then he or she is not exercising their responsibility. Because de facto, they will really severely impact 50% of that officers that they bring in. Okay? So I would say that then that officer is identifying him or herself as someone who we should not have empowered with that authority. Okay? So that's the first piece. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. The stopgap, which was really sort of your question, is when we stop the market and we actually get with the slate, we're trying to look to make sure that doesn't happen. I would also argue that the brigades should be having a healthy conversation with HRC to help them in that process to make sure that's not happening. Okay? It is one of the things we're definitely going to be looking out for. What other questions do we have? Got one more in the back.
Sir, Captain Adam Weeks, one I want to add. You mentioned that looking forward to opting into promotion boards. So captains, now you're looking at your majors at your 11th year of service. With opting out of promotion boards, how will that adjust timelines? How that would affect your promotion rates to major and then further on to lieutenant colonel?
So you want to like opt in or opt out?
Opt out.
So, I mean, opt out right now, I mean, I think the big one's going to be is what we're going to see when we do it with the majors board, okay? Because we did with lieutenant colonel's board, only 4 people chose to try to opt out of a promotion board. I think it's going to be very interesting when we get the word out more robustly for majors, and I think there's a whole lot of opportunities. I mean, what that would mean is, just simplistically, if we're gonna, if we've got 200 captains and we've got to produce 100 majors, and you had 10 that opted out, you just would roll those to the next year, and then 10 additional ones from that 200, it would be a different 10 that get promoted to be the 100. But I mean, I think it's about as simple as that in terms of what that looks like. But then that group that opted out is then probably going to bounce out. I mean, then that means, assuming this is the same number as the following year, then those guys who opted out, generally because I think they're pretty high level performers, that's going to have an impact on that group that they bounce back to. What other questions? Oh, okay.
Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Carroll. Are there tools or a deliberate process that you've considered to bring back in some of our peers that left that shouldn't have left? Where it's like, come back and serve with me. And actually, when I say that, it's like beside me. When I know my battle buddy that went out for one of those multi-factor decisions can come back and serve in my same unit almost as like a sponsor or something. To empower that.
So I think you raise a great point. And we have not blown into this hard yet, but I think we will over time.
Yes, sir.
But I think, so let's just, again, it's always interesting in this job, because you just take a look at the assumptions and sort of the implicit sort of decisions that we make in terms of how we manage people. Okay, so talking back to societal norms, where it's becoming an increasing societal norm where people bounce around from jobs to job. right? Like people just, the idea of like in the old days, the company man who's like gonna stay with one company and stay with IBM for 40 years, like that is increasingly rare across the American workforce, okay? And so people are jumping around, and they say millennials jump around all the time. Now, I think in some way, like I talked about, the fact that we move officers every 2, 3, 4 years sort of supports that to some degree. But to your point, I think it's really interesting that we can take somebody, educate them for 4 years at ROTC, pay for their education, employ them for 5 years in the military. So now they're like 27, 26 years old, and they actually want to go and pursue some opportunities out in the outside world. So I'd argue that when you leave the Army at like 26, 27, for the rest of your life, you're at your core, at least deeply instilled, the value. If you're the right officer, you're always sort of self-identifying yourself as an officer, right? Like all my buddies who got out still at their core sort of think of themselves as Army officers, even though they haven't served in 25 years, okay? But then what we say implicitly as an Army is, look, you're gonna leave the Army, so I don't think we ever say that you're a quitter, but we sort of look down on you. And here's the other thing we say. You're gonna go out to that outside world, and you're not gonna learn anything that would be of any value for us to incorporate back into our Army. And so that permeability path in just doesn't exist right now. And so that's something else that we're trying to look at and how we could do that, because that's another way of infusing it. I mean, it's less dramatic than the direct commission, right? Because you've already gone through a commissioning source and done that stuff, but it's bringing these skill sets back in amongst those who have left. And I think, like, I think what you're seeing is you'll see a tremendous appetite for people who would want to do that. And maybe they don't want to do it for 15 years, maybe they want to do it for 5 years. But you could look at all the different things the Army does, and that sort of lateral infusion of skill sets, whether it's recruiting or some of the technological fields, I mean, could really be of assistance to us. Yeah. So we are looking at it. We have not like fully fleshed out a course of action to get there, but I think it's important for us to be able to do it. Good. What other questions? That's a novel question too. So that's not what I've heard before. It's a great question though. What else? Okay, I'll leave you just with a final thought and let you get on with your day. I have now worked in 2 jobs related to talent management. I did it in my last job as the Deputy Commanding General for Army Cyber. And in that, what we're trying to do is drive change. And what I have learned very firmly is that every officer loves change until the change impacts them. So, if you're a second lieutenant or a first lieutenant or maybe a junior captain, first off, like, you don't even know the system really, and you just think it needs to be burnt down because it sucks. And I mean, I got it. Like, that's the way all lieutenants, that's the way I felt as well. If you're a really senior colonel, you think you're probably not going to be impacted by that. It's this middle group of these senior captains, majors, lieutenant colonels that we're now making significant changes to what their expectations have been within their profession. Okay? And so that's when we start talking to messaging, that's a really important group for us to be able to communicate. I would just go back to the point that there is an urgent need for change. Okay? I don't think we're going to do this perfectly. I've never seen a perfect system anywhere, certainly not in the Army. Okay? But what we're driving towards is something that is significantly better. Okay? So I'd ask you as leaders to understand and embrace the change. And if you see ways we can do this better, then let us know. Okay? Like, there is no one in our team who is trying to figure this out who, 1, has ever done this before, and 2, who thinks we've got this whole thing figured out. Okay? So feedback from the field, you embracing that change and being an agent of change is going to be really, really important. And I'm just telling you, because you're going to start feeling it, it's going to be most painful and difficult if you're actually being affected by these changes. Okay? And so I just look forward to your thoughts, your comments. Tell us how we can do this better. But I am really excited about the direction this is starting now to move the Army, and I think it is going to make the Army significantly better in the long term as we start doing these different initiatives. So thank you very much. Carry on, you're good.